Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're back with another 5-man Mythic Plus tier list, this time examining tanks within. The list is relevant as of Tuesday, October 5th, patch 7.1's release. So if you're watching this late in the future of the expansion, you may find very different results. I'd also like to remind everybody that these are my opinions purely based on experience I have from Mythic Plus 5-mans and also based on information from websites such as Warcraft logs and other parsing websites. I've taken the time to explain the pros and then some cons as well as group-wide utility for all 6 tanks. Since there is only 6, I'm able to go a lot more in depth than I was able to do with the DPS one. So hopefully this will be more satisfactory towards everyone's needs. And then of course I weigh things like utility very highly, tank survivability. These two are some of the most important things. And then also damage as well is something to consider. So if you guys have any questions about this list, let me know. Otherwise, let's get right into it. Tier 1, number 1 overall is Guardian Druid. They have some incredible pros that we're going to go through. Rage of the Sleeper and Embrace of the Nightmare, which is an artifact trait. On top of their active mitigation, Iron Fur is possibly the best combination of defensive abilities ever designed for high difficulty 5-man scenarios. It solves a lot of problems and allows them to be incredibly bulky. They also have an incredibly adaptive defensive kit that allows for both magic reduction and self-healing at the appropriate times. Even though they're not the strongest iteration of those two things, they are very potent in the hands of an already very tanky spec. And their mastery alone allows them to survive situations that most tanks may not. Having that high of a health pool and the increase in healing is just really something that smooths a lot of edges. Now, of course, they wouldn't be number 1 on the list if they didn't also have amazing utility. They have a great group-wide utility that comes from Battle Res. Of course, that should go without saying. Now you can use it in bear form as well, so very useful. They have Stampeding Roar as well, which is very good, has been in the past as well for challenge modes, and now will once again be very useful in Mythic Pluses. Anytime you could run a little bit faster in between packs is just a straight time gained. They also have In-Cap Roar, which can interrupt mobs, so the only tank that has a reliable AoE interrupt, even though it's not the best ability. And they also have a Knockback still, which doesn't have tremendous usage, but can also still function as an interrupt. It also knock mobs back and then kite away, knock mobs back when the binding trap's down, etc. So there's some great usage there. And then there is Entangling Roots still, which had some really good usage in the past 2 expansions. Not a tremendous amount of usage I've seen yet. Maybe you guys know more about that than I do, but regardless, Entangling Roots can always be very useful. So if there's a chance to use it as a tank, it's obviously another thing you need to consider. They have a few cons though, really only 1 or 2. Dash requiring cat form, so it's only really usable in between packs. And that's really my main complaint with Druid, is they feel very immobilized. Even with the changes they've made, your main mobility is tied to other types of utility, like either your interrupt or Stampeding Roar. So you have to make a choice if you want to be mobile. That's really the main issue that I have with Guardian, but otherwise they're incredibly strong. Tier 1, number 2 overall is Blood Death Knight. Their kit has changed substantially since last expansion, when they were by and large the only tank that could do challenge modes competitively, but they still have some amazing upsides now, especially after 7.1 small buff. Pros that you're going to see here are they will absolutely out heal healers in regular 5-man conditions, usually overall as well, but certainly on themselves. This allows healers a lot of free globals to DPS and can really make the difference in your times. The more mobs they fight, the stronger they become simply. Bone Storm as a talent and Umbilicus Eternus, which is a golden trait, get exponentially stronger with each additional mob attacking, and that goes a really long way when we're talking about dangerous large pulls in 5-mans. They also have a huge upside offensively, even after multiple nerfs across the last few months. Dancing Rune Weapon, Consumption, Bone Storm, and Unending Thirst all combine exponentially well with high haste, especially coming from Bloodlust, and still provide the full defensive benefit when using them for offense. They're practically unkillable if you ask me, with all CDs up, and now especially since they received Icebound Fortitude returning in 7.1, they have another great 30% 3-minute CD. That's really the only hole that they had, but it being returned in 7.1 is really propelling them up my favorites list. Also, Fall Bulwark plus Red Thirst, 2 talents, allows for Blood to have an extremely high health pool regularly. Not as consistently, obviously, as Druid, and not as applicable as Druid, but still, they have a very high health pool when they are using their CDs properly. They also, of course, have amazing group-wide utility, and this is the main reason why I put Death Knights on the top of the DPS one. So if you have these utilities from the tank role, you don't necessarily need them from a damage dealer, and that can go a long way as well, obviously. But number 1 is, of course, Death Grip. I think it's the single most useful utility utility in all 5-man content, especially with 3 dungeons in mind. There's a couple types of mobs that simply will not stand still, and keeping them where they need to be in group-wide AoE or even in some type of stun situation is extremely useful. And then of course they still have Gorfien's Grasp, which is a lot worse than it used to be, but still has great application, and have Battle Res, which debatably is the second strongest utility in all of 5-mans, because if somebody dies, say for example the healer dies, then you may wipe and you may lose a lot of time because of that, but if you can simply Battle Res them and salvage it, then you're all set. They do have some pretty big cons though. They're pitifully weak outside of CDs, absolutely paper thin. The spec has almost no passive benefit. It's really sad to see their healing and everything else stack up so vividly, but without anything up, like if you just went AFK, you would probably die in 3 or 4 melee swings in any serious situation. And they also have the worst active mitigation in the game. It feels very clunky and very ineffective, that being of course the absorb after you heal yourself with Death Strike. So I just don't know what they can do to change that. That wouldn't make them completely overpowered, but in general, if you play the class properly, those cons can kind of be outweighed pretty quickly. Number 1, tier 2. Number 3 overall is Protection Warrior. Ignore Pain and Shield Block, even after a few nerfs, are still probably better than most other tanks' defensives put together. They're just incredibly strong in the right hands, and if you know how to use Ignore Pain properly, you are really unkillable. They also have great mobility and ability to kite. They're the highest tank on the list in terms of mobility right now, and that can be very useful in a few affixes, especially ones such as Necrotic. They also have great potential to be high burst AoE, which is something that should never be discounted as a tank, but they do kind of require some situational talents such as Ravager and Avatar. But either way, they have a very wide defensive kit that allows for some type of sizable mitigation to be up near 100% of the time. If played properly, Ignore Pain and all your other CDs can really smooth out a lot of damage, and it's not entirely CD reliant like some tanks. And then there's still Spell Reflect as well, which actually got a very nice buff in Legion and has some really good application. So they really have a lot of wide defensive variety. Now in terms of group-wide utility, they're not completely devoid. They have Shockwave as a talent, which is the only tank stun remaining in the game other than Leg Sweep. It's extremely important to use this properly. Having a stun as a tank is a very easy way to get yourself out of a situation and can even help you kite very easily. And then they still have Intercept, which can save a healer's life especially. Using that properly may be the reason you do or do not survive, and it can still also be used to kite. And they still have Berserker Rage, which breaks some minor CC like fear and incapacitation, but do those even exist in Legion dungeons? I'm not actually sure. So if anybody has a good usage for Berserker Rage as a warrior, please let me know. In terms of cons, they are really hindered by not having a good self-heal. The only self-heal that's even available is Impending Victory, which is a talent, or Victory Rush Baseline, both of which are complicated to use comparatively to any other tank's self-heal, and that makes them a lot more reliant on actual healers. Also, I'd say that their offensive rotation feels kind of clunky and sometimes it's heavy. Sometimes you're waiting for things and you're sitting there pooling rage, and that doesn't feel very fun to me. It takes a lot more planning than most tanks to keep their rage maximized as well. Number 4 overall is Protection Paladin. They feature an extremely wide defensive kit tied mostly to CDs, but with incredible haste scaling. It includes a cheat death, a full health heal, and an immunity. 3 of the strongest things any tank could ever possess. They also have the single best global self-heal in the game, also encourages high haste, and it actually allows the healer to let them drop low to get better value out of it, so the healer can get a few more DPS globals in. It can also be used to heal the group too if talented. They have the Final Stand talent, which allows the Paladin to be entirely immune while an infinite number of mobs attack them. It can be useless or the best CD the game offers depending on the dungeon and situation. Regardless, it gives healers at least 8 seconds of DPS or a chance to catch up on the group if they need healing. They also have Blessing of Spell Warding as a talent, which neutralizes the necrotic affix, which should also be neutralized on top of Divine Shield, so very good coverage for a dangerous affix there. And they have incredible DPS all around, especially Burst Single Target, which has actually been buffed in 7.1. They have a straight up DPS increase in Wings and Seraphim, probably the only tank that you could actually say that for. In terms of group-wide utility, they don't have very much. They do have strong off healing if Judgment of Light and Hand of the Protector are chosen, but that really can only go so far. They have an AoE AoE blind, which can function as an interrupt, but it's also very useful for intentional wipe, like in Darkheart Thicket. You could run by the mobs and blind them, and since nobody's going to be dealing damage to them, they'll just stay in the blind for however long. In terms of cons though, in order to do good damage, you need to use your active mitigation recklessly. 3 of their main mitigations all do damage in some variety, and they need to be used if they're going to maximize their damage. And this can cause dangerous situations if you're inexperienced or the group makes some type of mistake while you don't have them. Also heavily reliant on consecrate positioning. This makes them very weak to mobs that are going to try to run out of it, mobs that are going to force you to run out of it, and any type of mob that is going to move in general when there are no grips available. Final tier, 5 overall, is Vengeance Demon Hunter. They have some incredibly high healing potential, probably second best in the entire game next to Blood, and that actually increases as the size of the pull increases as well. They have extremely high AoE DPS, especially in burst, and that can translate into defensive capabilities if used properly, as most should know. They're definitely the best kiting tank in the game, maybe ever. The mobility in general allows them to elevate the pace of the dungeon like no other tank can right now, and that can be incredibly important in a timed run. They have a pretty balanced defensive kit, nothing great, but they have a very high impact active mitigation, which is going to get really good with high gear levels. They also have a talented cheat death that can actually be used offensively with extremely high coordination. Really elevates the skill level, something that no other tank really can say for. They also have a wide array of playstyles that can change significantly with different talent builds, so if that's kind of your thing, then this is the only tank option like that. They play a lot more like a DPS than they do a traditional tank. In terms of group-wide utility, they're at the bottom because they have almost nothing. They do have sigils though, which can be extremely potent in the right situation with the right player, especially Sigil of Change. It can function as a Gorfiend's Grasp replacement, which is extremely good in some situations, but it's a little bit, well, it's a lot harder to use. They also have a ranged interrupt, something that you don't really see on tanks too often. It can actually help them tank too. It gives them resources. They do have some very definitive cons though, in that they're very different from traditional types of tanks. You have to be able to use their CDs and mobility properly in order to maximize both DPS and defensive benefit. Otherwise, you'll simply be mediocre if not inept at both. They're also extremely weak to stuns, probably the weakest tank to stuns now that Icebound Fortitude has returned, or any type of large hit outside of actual CDs. And finally, we come to Brewmaster. Despite being my favorite tank out of all 6, it is absolutely the worst for pushing high difficulty Mythic pluses. But the number 1 pro for them is 7.1. They got 2 extremely nice buffs. I don't know if it's going to be enough, but Brewmaster Monks now gain 15% additional armor from gear. That sounds really substantial, but doesn't really help them with any of their mitigation problems other than passive stuff. They also got Brew Stash, now lasts 4.5 seconds. That's a very good trait in the artifact. Every time you use your active mitigations, it gives you dodge for 4.5 seconds now. So hopefully those 2 things will smooth them out a bit and they'll be able to rise up this chart a little bit. Either way, besides that, Stagger/Clear is very well suited to mitigating a single very large hit. So once again, I'll say this every time I bring them up, if there's ever a situation where you have a snapping bite type mechanic, they're the best tank in the game for that. Their very low CD active mitigation can be very useful against any type of mitigation check that we might see, like the one at the end of Neltharion's Lair. They also have the best 1-2 punch global AoE DPS of any tank, arguably better than a lot of DPSers as well. They possibly have the best haste scaling kit of any tank. That's obviously yet to be seen, but based on how things look, it seems like they can be extremely good with high haste, but it would be hard to see the impact anytime soon. They're exceptionally mobile, definitely the second best in terms of mobility, and this allows their subpar mitigation kit to be less evident if you can actually kite properly. A lot of times if you simply roll away from mobs, you'll have a good 3-4 second window where you just aren't getting meleeed. In terms of group-wide utility, this is actually one saving grace for them. They have Leg Sweep, which is still only 1 of 2 stuns. They also have Diffuse Magic, which has some potential interest for 5-mans, but I haven't really seen a great case where you could actually reflect anything back onto mobs or bosses. In terms of cons, they're very clunky and they have a very awkward active mitigation model. Their major CD seems just absolute overkill to me. It's way too good and it's got a huge CD without high haste. It seems really backwards, really counterintuitive to every other tank's playstyle. They have very awkward AoE threat as well, especially if you do not have Rushing Jade Wind talented. It seems very difficult to pick up multiple killable mobs at range now that barrels is gone, especially any mob that is not naturally going to come towards melee range. Anytime a mob fixates on a healer or another damage dealer, you're basically running over to punch it, like if you're a classic warrior or something like that. They also are unfortunately given the worst single target damage of any tank. It seems really, really low to me, and they have no tangible DPS increase, which is a big deal. You can't really pop any good CDs when pots are up. They also have this terrible stigma socially, and I understand I'm not helping contribute to that in any way here, but truthfully, they aren't nearly as bad as everyone makes them out to be, but most groups simply will not bring them just because of that. So that's everything. If you guys have any questions about any of this, let me know. Otherwise, I just wanted to make a brief amendment to the previous video I made, which is the DPS tier list. A lot of that was weighted heavily towards utility in a vacuum. As I explained in the comment section of that video, I had to assume that you simply did not have a tank or a healer. So the things that I discussed in this video hopefully clarify a lot of the reasons those picks were made. For example, I had Death Knight very, very high on the list, but in this video I have Death Knight very, very high on the list as well. It's basically for the same reason. They're both very good at what they do, but also because they have very, very good utility in death grip and battle res. So for example, if you have a blood DK, then you might want to put down Unholy or Frost DK much further down the list, because you don't necessarily need 2 death grips almost ever, and having 2 battle reses isn't something that's always needed either. So it's important to consider that, especially with the tank and healer list. The DPS utility is going to be important, but the tanks, their main job is utility in a lot of ways, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, if you guys have any questions about anything you heard here, let me know. Otherwise, once again, this is all my opinions as of the 25th of October, the day patch 7.1 came out on US servers, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.